Good afternoon. Welcome to the President's Multidisciplinary Investigative Seminar. This evening, or this afternoon, we are pleased to have as our presenter Richard Rothstein. He will be discussing the President's Multidisciplinary Investigative Seminar. Okay, can everyone hear me?
Now we can.
All right, I'm going to start again. Good afternoon. This is, we welcome you to our premise investigative seminar. This evening, we're pleased to have Richard Rothstein, who will be discussing his book, The Color of Law. I am Dr. Pam Straker, Director of Operations for the Brooklyn Health Disparities Center. I'm joined by Dr. Carlos Patu and Dr. Mauro Salafu, who are actually principal investigators for Transport, which is actually the sponsoring organization for Premise. Additionally, I want to thank Dr. Powderly, who actually provided some funding for this series, and I would like to thank NIH, who also provided funding. We also have the pleasure of having Dr. Daniel Elke, who is from the School of Public Health at Downstate. Lakia Maxwell joins us. She is the research, the research education leader for the Transport program. So let me introduce Richard Rothstein. Richard Rothstein is a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He lives in California, where he is a fellow of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. A former columnist for the New York Times, Rothstein has spent years documenting the evidence that government not merely ignored discriminatory practices in the residential sphere, but promoted them. The impact has been devastating for generations of African Americans who were denied the right to live where they wanted to live and raise their children and send them to the schools they felt were best. I would like to introduce Mr. Rothstein.
Thank you very much, Dr. Straker. Is this all? You can hear me okay?
Pretty well.
Okay, well, all right. Well, thank you for inviting me to meet with you this afternoon. Let me begin by reminding you, all of us, that in the 20th century in this country, we had a civil rights movement. That civil rights movement began by challenging segregation in colleges and universities, and then went on, as you know, in 1954 to challenge segregation in elementary and secondary schools and won a Supreme Court ruling that prohibited legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that 1954 Brown versus Board of Education gave inspiration to a movement of activists who engaged in everything from marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience against segregation. Many people were injured seriously in some of those events. Others lost their lives. But by the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement, those activists had pretty much persuaded the country that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and to whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. In that period, through the 1960s, it succeeded with its activism in ending segregation in interstate transportation and buses and lunch counters and public accommodations of all kinds. And then in 1968, succeeded in getting a Fair Housing Act passed that prohibited future discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And then at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement pretty much ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. We live in an apartheid society. Clearly defined areas that are all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that are all black or mostly black. I've lived in many metropolitan areas in this country. Every one I lived in lived like that, looked like that rather. How could it be that we came to understand that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy, and yet left untouched the biggest segregation of all? Well, partly, I guess you could say it's hard to end residential segregation. If we pass a law prohibiting segregation in buses, the next day you sit anywhere you want on a bus. But if we pass a law prohibiting segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, liberals, conservatives, blacks and whites, northerners, southerners, we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for not continuing the civil rights movement to address the biggest segregation of all. And that national myth goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of lunch counters or buses or public accommodations, that was all done by government. We say if it was a federal government requiring segregation, the civil rights violation, a violation actually of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. If state and local governments were requiring segregation, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. All of these are civil rights violations. And as American citizens, we have an obligation to do something about it, to redress residential segregation. To redress civil rights violations. But we tell ourselves that residential segregation is something entirely different. We tell ourselves that residential segregation wasn't created by government. It was not created by law, by regulation, by public policy of some kind. Residential segregation, we tell ourselves, just sort of happened naturally. It happened by accident. It happened because private homeowners or landlords wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it happened because, private businesses, banks, real estate agencies, developers discriminated in how they carried out their work. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because blacks and whites just like to live with each other of the same race. So you feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all the result of income differences. African Americans on average have lower incomes than whites, and so many can't afford to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. All of these individual, personal, bigoted, but non-governmental decisions is what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves that what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We give a name to this rationalization. We say that what we've got when it comes to neighborhood segregation is something called de facto segregation, a term we all use. It just happened in fact, not in law. Well, excuse me, as you heard a few minutes ago, I used to be the education columnist at the New York Times. And I spent many years writing about education policy and writing columns as well as research reports on education. And I spent much of the 1990s and 2000s criticizing the dominant educational theory of education policymakers in this country. And that theory was that we had an achievement gap between black and white children. On average, black children achieve at lower levels than white children. But the reason for the achievement gap, we were told, was because teachers had low expectations of black children. They were bigoted. They didn't try very hard. And the theory was if only we could make teachers try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. I consider it a ludicrous theory, but we enacted it into law, into a federal law. It was called the No Child Left Behind Act. We required children to be tested every year. We were going to hold teachers and schools accountable for those test scores. And if we forced teachers and schools to pay more attention to these test scores, the achievement gap was going to disappear. So I said it was a ludicrous theory. It, of course, didn't work. We still have the achievement gap and just about the same magnitude that we had in 2001 when we passed that law. And it's not that the only thing, let me just say, the only thing that that law accomplished was that it gave schools an incentive to abandon a well-rounded curriculum and just spend all their time drilling children in math and reading so that they might be able to raise their test scores. But I regard the law as silly, and I wrote many, many columns about it, because the reason we have an achievement gap is not because teachers have low expectations. Of course, there are some big teachers who don't try very hard with low income or Black or Hispanic children, but that's not the major cause of the achievement gap. The most important cause is the social and economic conditions that children come to school with, and you're familiar with many of them. I remember writing one column, Trespassing on Your Turf, about asthma. As you know, in New York and Chicago and other cities like that, African-American children have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. I don't actually know, and maybe you can tell me later what the rate is in Brooklyn, but I think it's probably like that. And the reason that they have such a high asthma rate compared to middle-class children is because so many low-income African-American children live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, in some places empty lots kicking up dust. And in this column I wrote, I explained that if a child has asthma, not every child, but the child is more likely, if that child has asthma, to be up at night wheezing, coming to school drowsy the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children, identical in every respect, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to be drowsier in school on average, not by a lot, and achieve at lower levels when tests are given. Doesn't make a big difference, but then when you begin to think of all of these conditions that children in disadvantaged low-income neighborhoods come to school with, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning, which, as you know, has a measurable impact on IQ, or homelessness or economic insecurity, pretty soon you've explained the achievement gap. It's not that some teachers aren't bigoted, but that's not the major cause. And then as I was doing this work, I began to realize that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness. What happens when you have a school where every child is coming to school with one or more of these conditions? How can such a school ever be expected to achieve at the same levels of schools where children come to school well-rested and well-nourished and in secure economic environments? You can't have that expectation no matter how many laws you pass and no matter how often you test children. So I began to think of these schools where we concentrate children as being an educational problem. And we call those schools segregated schools. And schools today are more segregated in this country than they ever have been in the last 45 years. And the reason that they're so segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So neighborhood segregation becomes an educational problem as I looked at it. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated 2 school districts. One was Seattle, Washington. Another was Louisville, Kentucky. Both of those districts had a program where they permitted parents to choose the school that their child would attend within the district. But if that choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, the choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't. So if you had an all-white, mostly white school, and both a Black and a white child apply for the last remaining place in that school, the Black child would be given some preference because that child would help to desegregate the schools. A trivial program. How often do you have one place left? And both a Black and a white child apply for it. But the Supreme Court evaluated it, denounced the program. The controlling opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He explained, it's true, he said, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. But he said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And the neighborhoods are located are segregated, he said, de facto, without government involvement because of the private bigotry and actions of private businesses and self-choice and income differences that I described a few minutes ago. Well, I read this decision, this was in 2007, and I recalled reading something that happened some years prior in Louisville, Kentucky, one of those 2 school districts. Outside Louisville, in a suburb called Shively, an all-white suburb of single-family homes, there was a white homeowner who had an African-American friend living in downtown Louisville, renting an apartment. Had a wife and a child, wanted to buy a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this white suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community, sold it to his African-American friend. The African-American friend, by the way, was a decorated Navy veteran, but sold it to his African-American friend. When this decorated Navy veteran African-American family moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop it. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having caused a riot by selling a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like the de facto segregation that Chief Justice John Roberts is referring to. Maybe there's more to it than he knows. And I began to look into it further, and I discovered there were hundreds and hundreds of cases. I'm not exaggerating when I use these numbers, of police-protected, sometimes even police-organized and led mob violence to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. These were not just in border states like Kentucky. These acts of police-protected or led or organized violence were in New York, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Boston, and Maryland, and California, and in San Francisco, and Los Angeles, everywhere in the country. There were these actions of mob violence, every one of them, where the police were either protecting or organizing or leading mob violence, was a civil rights violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment. Police are agents of the state. And as civil rights violations, we have an obligation to remedy them. We've never remedied any of them. We've left them go unaddressed. And then I began to look into it further. And I found that there were many, many policies of the federal, state, and local governments that were equally explicit on a racial basis, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. Every one of them was a civil rights violation if the federal, state, or local governments were enacting these policies or ordinances or laws. We have an obligation as American citizens to remedy them. The notion of de facto segregation, I concluded, and that's why I decided to write this book, is utter nonsense. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. But for government action, we would not be living in the kind of apartheid society that we're living in today. So let me, for a few minutes this afternoon, describe some of the important policies that the federal government followed to ensure segregation in this country. I can only talk to about a couple of them. There are many, many more described in my book. Let me begin with perhaps the most powerful one, and that's a program of the Federal Housing Administration, the Veterans Administration, and the post-World War II period that was designed explicitly to move the white working class and lower middle class population out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. It was a racially explicit program. We had a lot more integration in downtown areas in the mid-early 20th century than we have today, simply because we were a manufacturing economy and jobs had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals so that factories could get their parts and ship their final products that way. And so both black and white workers were living close enough to be able to walk to work. Well, the federal government decided it was going to move the whites only from this integrated population in urban areas out to single-family homes in all white suburbs. You're familiar with all of these suburbs. They exist in every community in the country, every metropolitan area of the country. They create a white noose around downtown areas. The biggest one that happens is not far from you, east of New York City, Levittown. 17,000 homes in one place. 17,000 homes. That's what Levitt wanted to build and did build eventually. He could never get the capital to buy the land or build these houses. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money for such a speculative idea. We weren't a suburban country at that time. The banks didn't even think people would want to buy these homes. And this was true of developers all over the country who wanted to use the post-war prosperity to buy to build suburban subdivisions. The only way that Levitt could get the capital to buy the land and to build these homes was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development, the architectural design of the homes, the construction materials he was going to use, the layout of the streets, and it required commitment never to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration. These agencies even required that Levitt place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans and rental to African Americans. And those deeds are still there today. And they're there today in almost all homes that were built in this country in the early 20th century up until about 1950. These two requirements, not to sell a home to an African American and to place a clause in the deed prohibiting resale to African Americans, was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. This was a written federal policy of the Federal Housing Administration and adopted by the Veterans Administration. The Federal Housing Administration had an underwriting manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the application of builders or developers for bank guarantees, federal bank guarantees for their loans to build suburban subdivisions. The underwriting manual prohibited the recommendation of a federal bank guarantee for a project that was going to be integrated, that was going to sell to African Americans. The manual even prohibited the recommendation of a federal bank guarantee to a developer of an all-white project that was going to be located in the area where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would, quote, run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. In my book, The Color of Law, I have a photograph of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall in Michigan that a developer was required to build to separate his proposed all-white development from a nearby African-American neighborhood. And unless he built that wall, the FHA was not going to guarantee his bank loans. And when they did guarantee his bank loans. This was explicit federal policy written out in the manual. This notion of de facto segregation, as I say, is utter nonsense. We created a segregated society largely with this policy, but with many, many others as well, that we live with today. And we live with it today for a very understandable and reason. Those homes in Levittown, for example, but the same thing is true anywhere in the country. If I give talks like this in many, many places, and I always have an example of a development just like Levittown in that community. They sold at the mid-20th century. Levitt sold them for about $8,000 a piece. Any returning war veteran from World War II, any working class family with a job in the post-war economy, black or white, could have afforded that kind of a home priced like that. The Veterans Administration even sold those homes, allowed those homes to be sold to returning war veterans with no down payment. Whites were, as I say, subsidized to purchase these homes. African Americans prohibited from doing so. Well, $8,000 then, it's about $100,000 today. So think of $100,000 as the price of these working class single family homes in suburbs all over the country. As you know, I'm not telling anything you don't know, those homes no longer sell for $100,000. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in some parts of the country, much more than that. I wrote a column in the New York Times a couple months ago rather, about a community in California where those $100,000 homes now sell for $1.5 million. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the appreciation and the value of those homes. Most families in this country who have any wealth get it from the equity they have in their homes. Whites who were subsidized by the federal government to buy these homes at $100,000 had no idea that they were going to become middle class as a result of these purchases, but they did. They used this wealth that they gained from the appreciation and the value of their homes to send their children to college. They used it to take care of medical emergencies, perhaps, maybe temporary unemployment. If you have wealth, you can weather temporary unemployment. If you don't, as African Americans did not, because they were prohibited from participating in this wealth generating program, and you lose a job temporarily, you're pushed further down the economic scale permanently in many cases. The white families also used their wealth to subsidize their retirements, and they used their wealth to bequeath it to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans, as I say, prohibited from participating in this wealth generating program. Today, African American incomes, family incomes on average, are about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth is about 6% of white wealth, 5% of white wealth. You would think that if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But this enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, that we, all of us, have an obligation as American citizens to redress, and that we've never accepted that obligation. Well, there were many, many other policies that reinforced this one and created racial segregation. I can mention just a couple in the time I have left, but I won't go into too much detail. One of them was a policy of the Internal Revenue Service to grant tax exemptions to nonprofit institutions that were perpetuating or reinforcing or creating racial segregation of neighborhoods. In many cases, the mob violence that I described earlier that was driving African Americans out of homes in inner ring suburbs that they had legitimately purchased was led by parish priests who wanted to maintain the ethnic homogeneity of their parishes. Their churches continued to get tax exemptions, even this was an open policy. In fact, there was a minister and a church that was the plaintiff in the case that eventually prohibited courts from enforcing those racially exclusive deed clauses, the lead plaintiff in trying to defend them. Yet nothing was ever done about its tax exemptions. Every tax exemption that was given to one of these nonprofit agencies or institutions that perpetuated segregation was a constitutional violation. And in my book, I don't know where all of you are educated, but I talk about the University of Chicago, a well-known elite institution in this country. Robert Hutchins, the president and chancellor of the University of Chicago, throughout the 1940s, maintained an office of lawyers whose job it was to sue, to have African Americans evicted from homes that they had legitimately purchased in neighborhoods surrounding the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago's tax exemption was never challenged. At the state level, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, you'd say a private institution, had a code of ethics into the 1950s that prohibited sale of homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Every one of the realtors who subscribed to the code of ethics was licensed by a state licensing agency. Every time a state licensing agency licensed a realtor or a real estate agent who subscribed to that code of ethics, as they all had to do, was committing a 14th Amendment violation every time they granted such a license. Never been remedied. Public housing is something that I'll just mention very briefly. It did not begin as a program to house poor people the way we think of it today. Public housing, the first civilian public housing in this country, was created in the New Deal during the Depression by the Roosevelt administration. It was not for poor people. We had a 25% unemployment rate during the Depression, but public housing was for the 75% who were employed, had good jobs, stable incomes, could afford to pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. It wasn't subsidized. But every way that the Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency, built public housing, it built it on a segregated basis, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes described in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. That's not how we think of downtown Cleveland today, but as I mentioned before, we had many integrated neighborhoods in the early 20th century because all the jobs were in that place and workers didn't have automobiles to drive to work, so they all lived in the same neighborhoods. Well, Langston Hughes says he lived in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood, says his best friend in high school was Polish, says he dated a Jewish girl in high school. Pretty commonplace if you have an integrated high school and an integrated neighborhood. But the Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and created two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in Cleveland that otherwise would never have existed, and especially as it was reinforced with other segregated projects elsewhere in the city. Well, I said before, I don't know where you all got your education, so maybe it wasn't the University of Chicago. Maybe you know something about Cambridge, Massachusetts, the area between Harvard and MIT. The Central Square neighborhood was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half white and half black. But the Public Works Administration demolished housing there, built separate projects, the federal government, one for whites, one for African Americans, and with other segregated projects elsewhere in the Boston metropolitan area, created the segregation that we know today. There were so many of these racially explicit policies that federal, state, and local governments followed, that they created a system, interacting system of policies. They weren't coordinated, they didn't have to be. Each one reinforced the other. And when I was writing the book, my book, The Color of Law, I wasn't so much surprised by the individual policies, but what surprised me was how widespread these policies were and how much of an opportunity they had to reinforce each other with a common racial theme. Well, let me say a few words before I stop and we have a discussion. The policies to redress segregation are well known. No mystery about them. Think tanks, housing experts, policy experts spin out ideas all the time about how to redress segregation. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to make, as John Lewis said, good trouble, to make it uncomfortable to maintain the patterns of segregation that we have in this country on a completely unconstitutional basis. I'll mention a few of the policies to show how obvious they are, but I'm not suggesting that giving these ideas to public officials will make them happen, because there's no political support for them. In the absence of a citizenry that's aroused and organized and mobilized to end segregation. I mentioned these suburbs earlier that were created by the Federal Housing and Veterans Administration. Homes initially cost about $100,000 and now cost much, much more than that. Levittown is an example. Well, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 that prohibited future discrimination resulted in Levittown now having an African American population of about 2%. There are certainly African Americans who can afford to buy homes for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. But Levittown is located in a broader neighborhood that's about 15% African American. Well, here's a narrowly targeted remedy for that very specific constitutional violation. We should have an affirmative action program in housing whereby the federal government, and I'm just using Levittown as an example, buys up 13% of the homes in Levittown at market rates, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and resells them at deeply discounted rates to African Americans who would be living there today, but for the unconstitutional, I'm not talking about specific individuals who would be living there today, but they would have an African American population today if it were not for these unconstitutional policies. We also have programs at the low end of the income scale. I mean, the program I just described of an affirmative action program in housing would be targeted at working class, middle class African Americans. You know, working class and middle class African Americans live in much more poorly resourced neighborhoods than whites with identical incomes. But there are policies we have at the low income end of the scale also that reinforce segregation today. The biggest subsidy we have for low-income families is the low-income housing tax credit. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a program that's administered by the U.S. Treasury Department. It issues tax credits to states based on their population, and the states distribute these to nonprofit developers who then can build subsidized housing for low-income families. Absurdly, the Treasury Department regulations place a priority on placing low-income housing tax credit units in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. I'm certainly not opposed to building better housing in low-income neighborhoods. We should do that. We should build better housing in all neighborhoods. But to place a priority on the reinforcement of segregation, that's backwards. We should build better housing in those neighborhoods, but we should also be placing a priority on building affordable units for low-income families, disproportionately African-American and today increasingly Hispanic, in high-opportunity communities where there's access to jobs, to transportation to get to those jobs, to grocery stores that sell fresh food, to schools with better funded. That's where we should be placing more of our housing, but we're not doing so. And there's no opportunity to do so because many of the communities where we should be placing this housing have zoning ordinances that reinforce their segregation by prohibiting the construction of anything but single-family homes, and sometimes on large lot sizes. Those zoning ordinances, I think, are a violation of the Fair Housing Act, even unconstitutional because they reinforce an unconstitutionally created segregation. Well, what are the consequences of the segregation? Let me just conclude with this. What are the consequences of the segregation that we've created? Well, I've already mentioned the achievement gap in schools. You know very well it also contributes in significant ways to health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have, you know better than I, have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because they live in less healthy neighborhoods, more stressful neighborhoods, more polluted neighborhoods, less access to, both to healthcare and to grocery stores that sell fresh food. The segregation that we have is also an important contributor to the discrimination by police and the mass incarceration that results from it against African Americans. I'm not suggesting that there would be no police discrimination if we didn't have segregation against African Americans. There would be some. But when we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to jobs or the transportation to get to good jobs or the schools that have high achievement, we make confrontations between the police and those young men inevitable. Police begin to operate and develop practices that are similar to what the occupying forces, police forces used in colonial countries in the 20th century, whether in India or the Congo. The police are charged with controlling a suppressed population. And the tactics they use, stop and frisk, well discussed in New York, and other forms of police abuse stem from that. And finally, let me conclude by saying that the segregation that we created has a very, very dangerous and frightening consequence. And that is that the political polarization that we have in this country today, extreme polarization, that largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever create the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to understand each other's life experiences? That's another consequence of this segregation that we've created and that we're paying a very, very deep price for now. Well, as I said, what we need to redress segregation is not more policy ideas. We've got lots of them. We need a new civil rights movement that's going to make it uncomfortable to maintain segregated patterns. I am working with a group of national civil rights leaders to create something we call a National Committee to Redress Racial Segregation. Its focus will not be throwing policy ideas out. Its focus will be in supporting local civil rights groups that can take direct action in their communities to redress segregation. We were about to launch this national committee before the social distancing of the pandemic started. We've put it on hold, but we're going to launch it again very soon. And if any of you want to be on the announcement list for this launch, maybe Dr. Straker or someone else can figure out a way of getting me a list of your attendees who want to be on that mailing list. And I'd be glad to make sure they get the announcement. With that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to engaging with you in the discussion and the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you're going to have many people who may be interested.
Wow.
So we'll make sure that we get you a list. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Elke at this point. I think he will have some interesting questions. And Dr. Sally Fu, Dr. Patu, please join in.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Pam, and thank you very much, Richard, for joining us. This, your book, your work overall is incredibly eye-opening, and thank you for pointing out this important distinction between de facto and de jure segregation. We are, here in Brooklyn, we're about a mile away from Eastern Parkway. I don't know if you're familiar with Eastern Parkway, but it is considered to be one of the birthplaces of zoning, actually in the late 19th century. Now, you said a few words about zoning toward the very end of your talk there, but I wondered if you could walk us through a little bit about how zoning is used, how it has been employed historically, to really ingrain some of these inequities that you highlight, particularly when it comes to industrial and single family zoning. It all sounds terribly abstruse at times, but it has very real consequences to these residential patterns. So if you could talk a bit about that, I'd really appreciate it.
Is Eastern Parkway the Jackie Robinson Parkway?
It's close to it. It's near it. That's how you get to the Jackie Robinson.
Okay, all right. Well,
yeah.
that's something I'm very interested in. Well, in the early 20th century, let me say the major federal policies that I talked about a few minutes ago didn't begin until the 1930s because the federal government wasn't involved in housing prior to the New Deal. So the segregated patterns that existed before that were frequently created by local government, not by the federal government. In many cases, the zoning was, I'm not familiar a lot with New York zoning in the 19th century, but the zoning movement in this country really began in the early 20th century in significant amounts. And local authorities divided up a city into zones. And you're familiar with them, single family home zones, apartment zones, and they authorized the placement of industrial sites, polluting sites, toxic waste sites in zones where African Americans, that was the criterion, the explicit criterion, in zones where African Americans were living. No polluting sites, no toxic waste sites were placed in zones where whites were living. In 1917, the Supreme Court, which at that time was under the obsession that the 14th Amendment had nothing to do with granting formerly enslaved people rights of citizenship, but they thought it was designed for the purpose of protecting property rights. And so the Supreme Court in 1917 prohibited some border state cities from creating racial zones, explicitly racial zones. They typically were worded so that if you were white, you couldn't move on to a majority black block, and if you were black, you couldn't move on to a majority white block, with the idea that over time, this would create segregation where it hadn't previously existed. If you just think about it for a minute, you'll realize that those zoning ordinances that prohibited movement would have had no meaning if we didn't have a lot of integrated neighborhoods at that time. But the Supreme Court prohibited it on the grounds that interfered with the property rights of an owner to sell to whomever he wanted. Well, following that decision, in 1920, Warren Harding was elected president, and his Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, created a commission to come up with nationwide zoning proposals to evade the effects of that 1917 decision. And they came up with model zoning ordinances that didn't mention race, but that were the antecedents of the zoning that we have today. In 1926, even though the Supreme Court was going around defending property rights everywhere and preventing wouldn't let you have a minimum wage law, wouldn't let you have a health and safety law. All of these were interfering in the Supreme Court's view with the right of children, for example, to negotiate with their employers. But it permitted in 1926 the restriction of a property owner's right to build anything but a single family home in a residential neighborhood. And from that 1926 decision, based on the movement that Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover began, we got zoning all over the country that eventually locked in the segregation that the federal government had created after 1933. So if you had one of these working class suburbs that were created by the FHA and VA, as they grew in value, those suburbs adopted zoning ordinances that prohibited the construction of anything from single-family homes, and often even from single-family homes on large lot sizes. So these zoning ordinances, we call them exclusionary zoning rules, single-family only zoning rules, perpetuate an unconstitutionally created segregation.
Okay, Mr. Rothstein, we have some questions coming in. Latia, would you like to share one question?
Sure. This is from Zachary. With the current state of the economy, African Americans are disproportionately out of work and can't afford their rent in places that were directly affected by the jury segregation. As you mentioned, gentrification has brought the rent of neighboring apartments to ridiculous prices. Where exactly could African Americans who do not have wealth and are out of work and are living in these de jure segregated communities go from here?
Well, a couple of aspects to your question. Let me make one first point. I would not suggest that housing policies are the only way to solve these problems. We also need income policies, because one of the effects of the segregation that we've had was to depress African American incomes. Because they, as I mentioned earlier, if you have wealth, you can weather temporary unemployment. It's just one example. If you don't have wealth, you can't. So unconstitutional policies also contribute to the income gap. We need, for example, minimum wage laws that are much, much higher than the $15 that are talked about now. We need, of course, and you know this, we need a guarantee of health care so that people aren't impoverished as a result of a medical emergency. We need a reauthorization in practice of the right to organize unions that can raise the wages of low-income workers who are disproportionately minority. It's virtually impossible to organize unions now because of the way in which the National Labor Relations Act was watered down. By the way, the National Labor Relations Act, when it was passed, permitted the National Labor Relations Board, the agency that administers it, to authorize for exclusive bargaining rights unions that excluded African Americans from membership. So there are many unconstitutional policies that are behind that 60% income gap as well. So income policies are critical to what you're talking about. It's not just housing policies. When you come to gentrification, the policies to prevent massive displacement of gentrification are also well known. We need, for example, rigorous and strict rent control to prevent families from being effectively evicted because of an inability to pay rising rents in gentrifying neighborhoods. We need limits on condominium conversions in those neighborhoods. We need inclusionary zoning policies that require a set aside, as I said earlier, not just of units for low-income families, but for working and middle-class families, workforce housing. In many of these gentrifying neighborhoods, we have teachers and nurses and social workers and bus drivers, and construction workers who can't afford market rate homes either. They make too little to afford market rate, too much to get subsidies under the low-income housing tax credit. So they wind up having to leave their neighborhoods and have longer and longer commuting. And there's another policy I'd like to mention, if I'm not taking too much time with this answer. Another policy I'd like to mention which should be implemented nationwide to prevent massive displacement from gentrification. It applies not to renters, but to homeowners. There are many homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods who have owned their homes for many years, decades sometimes, who may have paid off their homes in full, no longer owe anything on them, but are forced to leave because they can no longer pay the rising property taxes in those communities. This is a nationwide problem. The Commissioner of Internal Revenue, former Commissioner of Internal Revenue under Barack Obama, his name is John Koskinen, advocates a plan whereby we freeze property taxes on all existing homeowners so that homeowners only pay taxes on the value of their homes when they purchase them. Now, California did something like this, as you may know. It was called Prop 13. It's a disaster. It's a disaster because that policy starves schools and the fire departments and other public libraries that depend on property taxes. But that's not a necessary consequence of such a policy. What John Koskinen advocates, and I'm adopting his recommendation, it'll be in my next book. He advocates that we freeze property taxes, as I've said, in existing homes, but then you recapture the lost property taxes at point of sale and return them to the Treasury. So that, for example, if you have a homeowner in a gentrifying neighborhood who may have owned her home for 30 years and bought it for $50,000 30 years ago and pays property taxes on the $50,000 rate and then sells it for $500,000 when the neighborhood gentrifies, instead of making a $450,000 capital gain, the property taxes deducted from that return to the Treasury, and she only makes a $400,000 capital gain. That's a policy that should be implemented in every community, and that would play a big role preventing displacement from gentrification. And by the way, it's not just single-family homeowners who would benefit from that. It's owners of duplexes who rent out an apartment on the second floor, who also have to leave under those circumstances. I'll try to be shorter from now on.
Wow. Well, this is a very, very full topic. Dr. Salafou or Dr. Patu, do you have questions before we take another one from our audience?
Yes, I would like to really thank Richard for a wonderful, talk. I have spent a lot of time, reading on this subject, and this is the first time that I'm actually hearing the real facts. It's amazing what you've said and what the reality of the situation really looks like compared to what you can read on the internet and other stuff. So this is very important. But briefly, I wanted you to go back to the No Child Left Behind Act. My impression is that in order to contribute to the disparity, we really need to start from the beginning. In other words, we can do all the other stuff, but if all the children coming into the world can get access to early childhood education and then from there move on, I think we have a big shot at, narrowing the gap a lot. So what do you say about that? Are we succeeding in that act, or are we just, back to where we were before the act?
No, we're not succeeding. All our focus has been on raising test scores, and the test score gap continues. And you're absolutely right. High quality early childhood education, and that should not be confused with pre-K for 4-year-olds. We need to start it much earlier than that.
Exactly.
And there's some good programs around the country. There's something called, I'm sure you're familiar with it, Nurse Family Partnership, that provides visiting nurses to pregnant women, and then continues those visits through early childhood and conducts educational guidance for those families. And we need high quality early childhood programs, like you mentioned, not just babysitting and not drill in math and reading, but programs that develop children's fine motor skills and awareness of the world around them, which is very narrow for many children who grow up in segregated neighborhoods. Many of them have never been outside of it. You can read about a hippopotamus much more easily if you've seen one in a zoo than if you just see the word and have never seen one. And so early childhood programs have to include those kinds of exposures as well. So you're absolutely right. And there's so many other things that we need to do. We need after school and summer programs and not homework help. but that also expand the horizons of children. The big problem is, and this is something I referred to when I talked about No Child Left Behind, is you cannot evaluate the quality of these programs by the test scores of their children, of the children who leave from them. The achievement gap in math and reading is one aspect of inequality, but it's not the only aspect, and it's not the biggest aspect. We can manipulate higher test scores with a lot of drill, but without programs, high quality early childhood and the other programs like I've described, as well as healthcare. I mean, we should be putting health clinics in schools so the children and their families can get access to high quality healthcare, preventive healthcare as well. All of these things develop aspects of the child that are not reducible to a math and reading test score, and they're absolutely essential. I will say, though, that while I agree with you that these things can narrow the achievement gap, so long as children are living in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, we're not going to eliminate the achievement gap. So the fundamental policy is redressing segregation, but I agree with you about all the other things you described.
Okay, Lakia, you have another question.
I wanted to follow through with that just quickly. A week from now, I am going to be giving a talk to the Greater New York Hospitals Association, and I'll be referencing your book. I just wanted to know that.
Good. I'm flattered.
Lakia?
Yes, our next question is, can you comment on how expressways such as the Robert Morris Expressway and other highways have created de jure segregation?
Well, sure. Well, you all know the story of Robert Moses. You're in New York. You know how he built what was it, the Southern State Parkway and the Northern State Parkway with bridges that were so low that people couldn't come by buses to get to Jones Beach because he wanted to keep African Americans. That was his explicit purpose. But throughout the country, it wasn't just Robert Moses. When the interstate highway system was built, beginning in the 1950s, local officials were given the authority to design the routes of the spurs from those interstates into their cities. And very, very frequently, not always, but very frequently, those spurs were designed for the purpose of creating segregation or for the purpose of displacing historic African-American neighborhoods that those local officials wanted to move farther away from downtown areas. The best example I know of that, and maybe some of you are familiar with it, is of the first one, is the Dan Ryan Expressway in Chicago, which is a barrier between black and white neighborhoods. That's how it was designed. In The Color of Law, I describe how I-95 in Miami was routed to destroy a historic and thriving African-American neighborhood and force the residents to move farther away from the city. And this was done in many, many communities across the country, and it was racially explicit. So this is another example of the state policy being used to create segregation.
Okay, and the next question is, what would you suggest to fix the educational system? Busing was tried and did not work. Would you recommend vouchers and allowing parents to decide to choose the school their children attend?
Well, no, I would not. As I say, the fundamental problem with our educational system is that children are living in neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage where their own problems are compounded by their exposure to everybody else's problems. I don't, New York is a very unusual place. And so my answer is not going to focus specifically on New York. But, you have a subway system, you have a transportation system that enables children to access different neighborhoods that are not far away. But in most parts of the country, most African American and white children live so far from each other that there's no way that a voucher system or a magnet school system or any other attendance zone fiddling can give children access to schools in higher opportunity neighborhoods. We now have a lot of experience with charter schools, which some people thought was going to be a solution to this. In the end, charter schools have not solved the problem. The average achievement of African-American children in charter schools is no greater than in regular public schools. There is a lot of money that goes into promoting charter schools. You don't hear about the successes of regular schools. There are certainly some great charter schools. There are also some great regular public schools. And on average, they're no different. And the reason is, it's easy to understand. When you deregulate any institution, what you do is permit expansion on the top of the quality and at the bottom of the quality. So if you have a charter school system that says, okay, charter schools don't need to hire certified teachers, some charter school operators will be smart enough to find very dedicated, mission-driven teachers who didn't go to education schools and get their credentials and hire them. And other charter school administrators will hire their cousin's daughter, who is untrained and unprepared. And so on average, what you've done is you've raised the ceiling and lowered the floor, and you get outcomes that are no different from regular public schools. With vouchers, we have a big difference in parents' ability to evaluate the quality of a school. And with vouchers, what you're going to do is get more highly educated, more motivated parents choosing better schools, and less educated, less motivated parents choosing worse schools. So I'm a big believer in public education, and but I'm a big believer in desegregated public education.
All right, Dr. Elke.
All right, thank you very much. Reading your book, it's easy enough to think that, well, the reason we came up with this raft of policies that had such horrific effects when it came to residential patterns and outcomes is because, well, people were racist, right? Or, you can also turn to the explanation of just structural, institutionalized racism. But there are several myths that I think you highlight that really kept alive some of these policies. And I wonder if you could comment on perhaps at least one or two of them. The one I have in mind particularly is the myth that was constructed about the appearance of African Americans wishing to move into a mainly white neighborhood, lowering property values, and how that myth got constructed and what the consequences were. And I guess another story that was often told was the fear of racial strife, right? If there's too much mixing, there's going to be fighting, there's going to be rioting, there's going to be strife. So I wonder if you could talk about, these myths, these stories, why they got constructed, why they were perpetuated, and what effects they had.
Well, I'll try to take less than 3 years to answer that question.
Sorry about
that. Let me address one of them that you mentioned, and that is the myth of falling property values. I mentioned earlier that at the very beginning of my talk that there were many African Americans who moved to predominantly white neighborhoods that surrounded traditionally black neighborhoods. African Americans were overcrowded, and those who had good jobs could afford to move to the nearest surrounding neighborhood, which was all white. When they did so, property values in those neighborhoods increased. They increased because African Americans, who had a smaller supply of houses to choose from, because they were excluded from so many places than whites, African Americans were willing to pay much more for a home in one of these surrounding, typically either urban, suburban communities or inner ring suburbs, willing to pay much more than the white would. So if you had a white family who wanted to move for whatever reason, take a job somewhere else or get a bigger home or whatever, and they put their home up for sale, it was to their advantage to sell it to an African American, not to a white. They get much more money for it. But once that happened, and so property values increased. And if you went into these neighborhoods, and there are many, many accounts of it, you could just see that the black homes were maintained much better. They had many more improvements in these neighborhoods. But then once they moved in, Speculators and real estate agents preyed on that neighborhood to prey on people's fears, white people's fears, that their neighborhood was going to become a slum. Because, of course, African-American neighborhoods in the urban areas were in many cases slums because people were so overcrowded. So few services were provided. Public services were provided. So it was easy for whites, even whites who may not have been bigoted, to think that African Americans were slum dwellers and would bring those conditions with them. Well, these speculators would go into those communities and panic whites that if they didn't sell soon, they were going to lose all the value of their homes. Their property values would decrease. In The Color of Law, as you know, I describe one real estate agent speculator who bragged in a national magazine that he organized burglaries in neighborhoods after an African American moved in to persuade whites living nearby that their neighborhood was going to deteriorate because of black presence, hired young African American men to drive through the neighborhood with their radios blasting, hired African American women just to walk through the neighborhood pushing baby carriages. Many tactics like this these speculators used. And then they scared the white families. The white families then sold their homes at much reduced value to the speculators, who then turned around and resold them to African Americans at above market value. But then once the neighborhood became all African American, the demand for those homes decreased because whites no longer wanted to live there. And so the property values then did decline. But this is a cycle that was created by, I keep on using the word, perhaps overusing it, unconstitutional behavior on the part of real estate agents who were licensed by the state. And in my book, I don't remember if I talked about this or not. You know, I spent a lot of time accumulating material. Only a small fraction of it went into the book. But in California, you may know the Stanford area in Palo Alto, in one of these neighborhoods where an African American family first moved in, and paid more, East Palo Alto, across the freeway from Stanford. And once the African American family moved in, the president of the California Real Estate Board set up an office there to panic white homeowners into selling. And eventually that became a low-income black neighborhood in East Palo Alto. Of course, the civil rights groups at the time protested to the state licensing agency, and about the practice of this realtor, who is the president of the California Association of Realtors, and the state licensing agency said that racial discrimination was not their concern.
Thank you very much. I believe Dr. Patu has a question.
This has been a wonderful presentation, but one of the things that struck me just in this answer is that we're heading into a presidential debate tonight where the campaign has focused on what we're talking about as if it was a historical paradigm rather than what we are currently watching. In the context of all the work you've done, are you surprised with, hopefully limited, nonetheless, the traction that this has gotten, or not?
Well, I'm very surprised. I had trouble publishing this book at first. No literary agent would handle it because I was told by 6 of them before I finally found one that would handle it that we were in a post-racial society and nobody's interested in this kind of thing. So I'm stunned by the reception that my book has had, but it's not just my book. It's Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. It's Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. It's the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates. If you look at the bestseller lists, in the New York Times, it's not just my book that's there, but just about every book is about, a nonfiction book is about race in one aspect or another. So we are actually having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race in this country than we ever have had before in American history. I'm surprised by it, but I'm also very hopeful. In writing this book, I became hopeful. I know that some people tell me that they got depressed. I got hopeful because so long as we thought it happened by accident, we could think it only cannot happen by accident. Once we understood that it was created by policy, we could understand that policy can uncreate it. And then these Black Lives Matter movements, the demonstrations, 25 million Americans participated in it, most of them whites, unheard of in memory. We have white elected Southern politicians running around the South, removing statues that commemorate the defenders of slavery. That was inconceivable just a few years ago. So we're having a more accurate, passionate discussion about race than we ever have had before. But, as I said, it has to go beyond discussion. It has to lead to local civil rights groups that are created to cause good trouble around issues of residential segregation. I'm hopeful that can emerge out of this passionate and accurate discussion. I'm not confident, but I'm hopeful. And you can do a lot to contribute to it. Now, I talk to groups like yours. I'm not talking to you as physicians. I'm talking to you as citizens, because all of you can be participants in this new civil rights movement if it does emerge.
Okay. We have one more question from the audience. So, Lakia?
Yes, question just came through. Have you looked at the high rates of COVID-19 in communities of color in neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s?
Well, of course, and this is something that you know much more about than I do. It's not that COVID is a racial disease. It's that in neighborhoods where social distancing is more difficult because they're so overcrowded, where people have the kinds of jobs that they can't get on their computers and work from home, it's inevitable that the virus will spread more in those neighborhoods than it does in neighborhoods where people are working from home, can social distance, can live in places where there aren't many people to a room and having to interact with others on the outside in their jobs. So yes, it's the disproportionate damage that the COVID virus is doing to low-income segregated neighborhoods is the direct result of segregation and the overcrowding of communities that where people did not have the opportunity to live in more highly resourced neighborhoods.
So you have another expert in that area on this panel, and that's Dr. Filippo. So those of you who are listening, if you ever have the opportunity to hear him speak about COVID and the intersect between social determinants of health and COVID-19, you will get a good excellent presentation. Again, I'm turning it back to Dr. Elke.
All right, thank you very much. One thing as I was reading, I saw progressive figure after progressive figure look a lot less progressive when it came to many of these housing policies. And Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and of course, Franklin Roosevelt relied on Southern Democrats, many of whom had racist political beliefs, relied on them for much of the New Deal, support for the New Deal. But I'm wondering, that there are many people come across, villain is a strong word, perhaps. I don't want to avoid that. But who would you say are some of the heroes of your story? Maybe some unexpected heroes, potentially, who come out of this narrative when it comes to the struggle over housing. Maybe George Romney comes to mind, maybe a little bit during his heyday.
Yeah, I think George Romney might be one. As I describe in the book, he was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development during the Nixon administration, at the beginning of the Nixon administration. The subtitle of my book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It was no secret. In the mid-20th century, everybody was well aware of the unconstitutional nature, well, they may not have used that term, of the government involvement in the creation of segregation. George Romney, as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, said that the federal government had created a white noose, that term I used before, around areas. And he said it was the responsibility of the federal government to untie that noose. And he proposed a program called Open Communities, in which he proposed to deny federal funds, particularly community development block grant funds, to suburban communities that would not open up and desegregate. And he actually did withhold federal funds from 3 suburban communities, something that goes far beyond what the Obama administration was able or willing to do. He withheld it from an area near Cleveland. He withheld it from Warren, Michigan. He withheld it from Baltimore County. And President Nixon clamped down on him, made him cancel the Open Communities program, and we've never had anything so aggressive to challenge neighborhood segregation since.
Thank you.
So that's a hero for you.
All right.
Okay. Do we have other questions?
Yes, I see that. I skipped one earlier. This is a follow-up of Dr. Elke's question. Can you discuss rezoning policies and mandatory proportions of low-income housing? Do you see that as a useful and or effective approach?
Sure, but as I said, there's no political support for them. The policies, I say I'm writing a new book. I'm going to go into, but the long lists of policies like the one you just described, and I think it's useful. But there's no political support for them unless we have a new civil rights movement. And Pamela, I don't have your email address, but if I would like to send you information about how people can volunteer to be part of this committee. So if you would send me a note, I'm sure you have my email address. I will respond to it.
I actually have your publicist, but
well,
I will get to you.
All right. Okay. Well, yeah, get it to me. And in any event, so yes, I think, look again, in answer to your question, I think that's a useful policy. But the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard suburbanites, at this point, are powerful enough to stop that policy from being implemented. And so that's our challenge. It's not coming up with the policy ideas.
Okay. So we are in the final minute of our time. And I just would like to thank you so much for what has been really an inspired discussion. And frankly, I could listen to it for quite a bit more. But if we do not have other questions, we're not going to just have you hanging around. Dr. Salafu, Dr. Fatu, Dr. Elke, I want to thank you so much for joining us and to adding to a critically important discussion. And Mr. Rothstein, we're going to call you.
No, you're going to call me Richard, please.
Okay. Well, we thank you so much. I really mean it. I could listen to this for a while. So I think I may have to do your book on tape so I can be reminded of this. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add?
Big thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you.
Okay.
Okay.
And I will be in contact, Richard. I'll be in contact. I do have your phone number, so I will text you.
Oh, I don't text. I'm too old to text. No. Just send your email address to my publicist and I'll respond to you. Okay? Okay?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Good
evening.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Okay. Luke?